I have stated time and time again that the Fire Emblem series is recognized and universally acclaimed for many different aspects. But for me, the one aspect of Fire Emblem that is done the best is by far the characters. Fire Emblem excels at having a cast of varied and interesting characters which offer so many different traits, personalities, and backstories. These guys and gals can be beautiful and kind-hearted, headstrong and arrogant, tragic and cold, noble and brave, fair and graceful, downright hilarious, or just plain badass. The characters in Fire Emblem are also essential in terms of gameplay, as they make up your team of units, and it's up to you to use each of the class-specific skills to achieve victory against the enemy, as well as decide which units to support with each other in order to see more of their personality and backstory, and for the most part, the characters in Fire Emblem are all very likeable and worthy to use on your team. For the most part. Yes, like any form of fiction or even general storytelling, there are characters that exist within the Fire Emblem series that, while more often than not, aren't bad characters, aren't very good units, and are hardly ever sent out into the battlefield. And today, this is what this list is all about, as I count down my top 10 worst Fire Emblem units, and this list was requested by both YouTube users Devion O and Stephen Bentley. Now before we get started, I need to address this since this is a very personal list, and when I talk about worst units, I'm not saying which ones are the all-around weakest. I'm referring to the ones I don't like using in battle, since they aren't very helpful, and or I'm not a huge fan of their character, or in some cases, lack of. I can guarantee that people will disagree with this list, and that they'll bring up why X, Y, and Z aren't on this countdown, but that's what's so great about Fire Emblem, because the characters are so well done and fleshed out, everyone has different favorites or hated units. There are many people who don't like Sumia, and I've expressed my love for her on multiple occasions because I thought she was not only a great unit, but also such a wonderful character to me. In fact, a lot of you were upset that I didn't put Oswin as the greatest general in my top 10 Fire Emblem classes video, because you guys love him so much, and that's what makes Fire Emblem so memorable. So when I talk about my least favorite unit, please don't get too hurt or offended if I mention someone you happen to like. Just one more thing, a lot of these units in this countdown aren't even that bad, but I find that there are better units to use as an alternative, and as such I don't use these units very often and don't like them very much. And like with every other Fire Emblem video I've made, I'm only looking at the units in Fire Emblem 7, Sacred Stones, Path of Radiance, Radiant Dawn, Shadow Dragon, and Awakening. Additionally, I'm not including any NPCs, since they're not used in battle despite some of them being the most despicable characters in the entire series, and I'm not including the bosses in Awakening, since most of the time I don't even bother recruiting them, because in my opinion, they should have all stayed dead. And I don't care if this game is out of Japan and it's been translated online. I'm not including Fire Emblem Fates, since there is a massive difference between seeing a character's personality in action rather than experiencing it. And with that all cleared up, I'm going to take a leaf out of Ike's book and fight for my friends, but these 10 units aren't as such. Starting off this list, we have a character who is by no means bad in terms of being a character or playable unit. However, he's not that interesting of a character, and there are much better units to use as alternatives. And this character is none other than Sacred Stone's very own Artur. As I said before, Artur is by no means a bad character or unit, but trust me when I say there are better units to use in Sacred Stones that do Artur's job pretty much better in every way. But let's at least see what Artur has to offer. Artur appears in Chapter 4 of Sacred Stones, and is the first magic-based class you receive, more specifically the Monk class. What's so special about the Monk class? Well, in this game, just think of them as mages who specialize in using light magic. As such, Artur's main use in Sacred Stones will be to fight monsters like zombies and demons, since light magic is super effective against them. Artur has overall good stats, and because a lot of monsters have low resistance, he can be very useful at taking them out. Artur is also one unit who really becomes useful when promoted, thanks to the major boost in stats he gets and the abilities he can use. But Artur, to me, kind of falls flat for a few reasons. First off, while yes, Artur excels at fighting monsters, he's not so good against regular units as he doesn't do as much damage compared to a certain other character, Not to mention light magic doesn't last as long or is as easy to combat in Sacred Stones for the most part. And while yes, there are a lot of monster units in the game, they're still outnumbered by the amount of normal units. Secondly, both Natasha and Lute are overall much better choices as both either for a sage or a light magic user, since you can get Lute in the same chapter you get Artur, and while she doesn't have as much defense and HP, she deals much more damage as well as having better luck and speed, and having very good growth rate, making her the overall best mage in Sacred Stones. And when it comes to Natasha, even though she starts out as a cleric and can't fight, she still has really good resistance, magic and luck, so that when she promotes into either a bishop or a Valkyrie, I tend to go with Valkyrie. The added movement and defense really helps. She gains the ability to use light magic and thus becomes my main light magic wielder in Sacred Stones. Character-wise, Artur isn't bad by all means, but I don't find him to be too interesting. I mean, I like his supports with Lute and they have a nice romance together, but aside from that, he doesn't have much personality and not a very interesting backstory in my opinion. Artur is by no means a bad character or unit, which is why he's only at number 10, but it's simply a case of having better and more interesting characters or units to use as alternatives in this case. So I can't be too hard on the guy, and I do use him on occasions, but overall, Artur is just kinda meh. The main gimmick behind Fire Emblem Awakening, and the reason it has so much replay value, is because depending on which characters support together, their children will come from the future and will have different stats and skills depending on their parents. Now this can lead to certain children becoming stupidly overpowered depending on their parents, but each one has different base stats, and I find that certain children are simply better than others regardless of their parents. As such, we have number 9 on this list, Laurent. Again, like with Artur, Laurent is not a bad unit, and I've used them a few times in Awakening. But not only are there better alternatives to use as a mage class, but I feel the thing that hurts Laurent the most is his personality, which I will get into later. Laurent is the son of Muriel, who oddly appears 3 years earlier than Lucina when they all travelled back in time, and can be recruited in Parallel 14, Shadows in the Sand. What's good about this is like Owain and Kashiel, Laurent can be recruited right from the get-go, rather than having to grind for so fucking long like with certain other children. And as such, he can be rather potent during the middle of the game. It's only later that you realise Laurent really isn't worth using in the long run, for two main reasons. First of all, Laurent is probably the weakest of all the children. I mean yeah, depending on his father his stats will vary, but overall Laurent isn't that strong, and really doesn't have any unique skills or traits to make him stand out or be unique. Another problem is that at least 90% of the other mages in Awakening are better than Laurent. Don't believe me? Well, consider the alternatives. Tharja, Rickon, Lisa, Maribel, and Henry. All of these units I find to be overall better than using Laurent and have much more uniqueness and personality to them. Which brings me to my next point, Laurent's character. Laurent acts very cold and calculating like his mother, almost to the point of essentially being a male version of Muriel. As such, a lot of his dialogue and conversations feel like they're copied and pasted from Muriel's interactions. Now granted, I really like the interactions Laurent has with his mother. Seeing these two scientific minds exchange ideas and theories is very fun, but every other conversation Laurent has is rather boring, which is a shame because the other children in Fire Emblem have loads of colour and personality to them, and are quite often the complete opposite of their parents. I mean, just look at characters like Brady, Jerome, and Owain. Overall, Laurent's main fault is more of him being a character than a poor unit, since he can be useful mid-game, and if trained properly, can be very strong at the end. But the other mages in Awakening I find to be overall better choices, and as such, Laurent essentially becomes Muriel 2.0. Okay, this character is an odd one for me, because she is playable in both Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn. However, I missed the opportunity to recruit her in Path of Radiance, and haven't had a chance to try and get her since. Why? That's why, because I'm not paying that much money for this game, regardless of how much I love it. As such, I'm going more off my experience of using her as a unit and seeing her character in Radiant Dawn, and this character is none other than Astrid. I imagine this may raise a few eyebrows, but like I said before, I'm more going off how she is in Radiant Dawn more than Path of Radiance, and because of that I found Astrid to be a rather underwhelming unit and I really don't know how I feel about her character, but I'll get into that later. Astrid first appears in Path of Radiance as a bow knight, and can be recruited in Chapter 13 alongside Gatry, and Astrid appears once again in Radiant Dawn as one of the Crimea Royal Knights. Gameplay wise, because I wasn't able to use her in Path of Radiance, I don't have any first-hand experience of using her. With that said, I've seen loads of people use her very effectively in Path of Radiance, and often she becomes their main archer unit, and I can see why. By the looks of things, Astrid is very potent in Path of Radiance, so I'll give her credit there. In Radiant Dawn, however, Astrid got one hell of a downgrade. I mean, yeah, she has good resistance and luck, but her poor HP and speed makes it difficult for her to last long in battle, and often can only be useful for finishing off the enemy rather than taking them out single-handedly. Now helping this is that 1. The Crimea Royal Knights are a very small battalion, and as such, you'd want to focus on training the strong units like Jeffrey, Kieran and Marcia. In fact, I'd say that Astrid is the weakest unit within the Crimea Royal Knights. And this leads to my second problem, the fact that this is Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. This is the Fire Emblem game that pulls no punches and does not hold your hand. As such, you have no opportunities to train units or grind levels. The game pretty much forces you to find out which units are the best and level the fuck out of them to stand any chance of winning. And it's because of this I don't like using Astrid, since training her is very difficult and time consuming. Also, she is completely outdone by Shinon, who is without question the best fucking archer in Fire Emblem ever. Character-wise, Astrid actually does have a rather interesting and sympathetic backstory. She was born into a noble house of Bentley, and as such, her siblings were married off to nobles that they didn't even love or grow to love, which is evidenced by the letters she received. Anyway, Astrid was engaged to Duke Lacane. Yes, that Duke Lacane, fucking piece of shit scumbag. Not wanting to suffer the same fate, she ran away from home and eventually found herself guarding Apostle Sarnaki. When their ship is attacked by Dayan and Ike intervenes, she, along with Gatry, joined the Grail Mercenaries. Astrid is a rather timid and shy character, but has a kind heart and is very forgiving, which I like, so I wouldn't call her a bad character or unlikable. Her romance with Malakoff, however, is in my opinion really poorly done and doesn't help her character in the slightest, since I feel the romance is completely one-sided. In Path of Radiance, Astrid gives Malakoff her family heirloom, which he tries to sell for money in order to gamble, and only after being scolded by Marcia does he return it, which causes Astrid to have deep respect for him. Only she shouldn't, because he didn't stop himself out of his own free will or the kindness of his heart, but rather Marcia forced him to give it back, and in Radiant Dawn, Astrid defends Malakoff at every turn despite him being a drunken idiot, and never even attempting to change his ways. Hell, Marcia, Jeffrey, and Callie question Marcia about her actions, but she just acts oblivious to them, which in my opinion doesn't add to her character, but rather makes her seem far too ignorant. I reckon if I played through Path of Radiance with Astrid as one of my main units, then she probably wouldn't even be on this list, but my experience with Astrid mostly stems from Radiant Dawn, and as such, she's not a very good unit or character in that game, and thus lands on the number 8 spot of worst Fire Emblem units. Okay, so I said before that the majority of children in Fire Emblem Awakening are the best units in the game and worthy to add to your team. Well, like Laurent, this particular child really doesn't add much to the battlefield, and comes in a point in the game where your units are very high, almost max level, meaning he's very difficult to train and not worth using in the long run, which is a shame because I actually really like this character in terms of personality and backstory. It also sucks that in order to recruit him, you have to play through one of the worst and most frustrating chapters in Awakening. Yep, it's Yarn. You've got to feel bad for the poor guy. Yarn is a very interesting character, and I really like the support conversations he has. It just sucks that he doesn't fare well on the battlefield, and in order to get him, you need to slug through rival bands, which I've talked great lengths about how much I hate this chapter in another video, but alas, let's break this down bit by bit to see what Yarn has to offer. Yarn is the son of Pane, and is the only other Tagul in Fire Emblem Awakening. As such, he has all the perks and weaknesses of being a Tagul, and is essentially a more potent Pane, with additional skills based on who his father is. Stat-wise, Yarn is actually rather good, since he has very good luck and decent strength and defense, making him an overall decent unit. The only problem being that he is recruited at the tail end of the game. As such, you really can't do anything with him since he's significantly underleveled and takes an unhealthy amount of time of grinding in order to make him useful. Now helping this is that while he is more powerful than Panay, he sucks compared to Naui, Na, and Tiki, all of which you can get earlier than Yarn and are just better in every single way. Yarn also tends to have very poor resistance stats, so even at high levels he won't fare well against any potent mages. Though Yarn lacks on the battlefield, he makes up for it with his character. Unlike Panay, who is cold, serious, and extremely brave and furious, Yarn is a complete and utter coward, being very timid and worrying about everything to the extreme. This is mainly due to the fact that he is the last of his species, and as such he fears that if he dies, the Tagul will become extinct. Which actually makes his cowardice very interesting and understandable, since he's got this massive burden of being the last of his species, and the fact that the entire world is at war, it's safe to say Yarn is going to hide in a hole for a while. I also find his supports with his father, in this case Frederick, very funny, as he wants to ensure that Frederick doesn't cheat on Panay and cause him to never be born, which leads to Yarn becoming very paranoid, and well, you can imagine how he would act in this situation. Yarn is a good character, and has a lot of good support conversations, but he is also a very poor unit, and is not worth the struggle to get or even train. If he appeared earlier in the game, and the chapter to get him wasn't so difficult, then Yarn wouldn't be on this list in a million years. However, that is not the case, and I feel it's best you stay inside your hole, Yarn. You're not exactly suited to fighting. As I mentioned in my top 10 worst Fire Emblem classes video, the Dancer class varies from game to game on how useful they were. I felt that Fire Emblem 7 used them better than being able to boost your stats. Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn used them very well as the Herons, allowing multiple units to move twice as well as healing adjacent allies, and in Awakening, the Dancer class, despite being very weak, could use swords to defend themselves. Sacred Stones is where the Dancer class is at its worst, and because of that, number 6 on this list unfortunately goes to Tempest. Like with Yarn, Tempest is another case of being a good character, but a poor unit. And since she is essentially the worst Dancer class, Tempest really has a lot of shortcomings on the battlefield. Now stat-wise, Tempest is surprisingly beefy, since she has great HP, speed and luck, and resistance, making it so that it's very unlikely that she will get hit by enemies, and even if she does, she won't immediately die. That really doesn't matter in the long run, since Tempest can only allow a single unit to move twice in one turn. Now granted, this has its uses, especially in boss battles, but it still makes her a very situational unit, and I said in my last video that the Dancer tends to only do well in maps with close spaces. Well, the problem there is that the maps in Sacred Stones are very open and broad for the most part, allowing the enemy to attack you from multiple angles, which really doesn't help when it comes to using Tempest in battle. Character-wise, I really like Tempest. Being Ewan's older sister, Tempest spent most of her life trying to best support them both, as they were abandoned as children, and she had to use her dancing skills to make money. Despite the harsh lifestyle, Tempest is very sharp and observant, easily being able to spot even the smallest details and understand the people around her better. I also really like the romance she shares with Garrick, since he reveals to her how he got his scar and how it changed him as a person, and Tempest also tells him about what happened to both her and Ewan, which allows them to understand and trust each other more than other characters in Sacred Stones. And I really do like this romance between them, and yes, I do ship these two a lot. Once again, we have another case of a good character, but a bad unit. If Sacred Stones handled Dancers better, Tempest could easily be one of my favourite units in Sacred Stones if she could do more on the battlefield. I think she is a wonderful character, but in a game like Fire Emblem, that can only do so much, and it really pains me to do this. I guess it just wasn't meant to be. Okay, in a series as big as Fire Emblem, there's going to be those few characters who really don't make any sort of impact on you, often leading to you completely forgetting they even existed in the first place. Well, number 5 on this list is a character who really fails to stand out in my eyes. Not for being a bad character or unit per se, but rather being just so average and lacking any sort of unique flair or strength. And this unit is none other than Devdan. Or is it Danvet? No, I'm sure it's Devdan, but I swear it was Danvet. You know what, fuck it, this guy. I really don't know what to say when it comes to this guy. I mean, I don't necessarily think he's a bad character, but at the same time he's not exactly a good character either. He's just so average. And this level of averageness is reflected in his stats, but I'll get to those soon enough. Devion first appears in Path of Radiance, where he is forced to work as a guard for Duke Tennis, and only after realizing that the Duke has been keeping Lagoos as slaves does he join Ike's side. In Radiant Dawn, Devion now refers to him as Danven and swears that there is no connection between the two. Don't ask why, I've got no idea. Personality-wise, Devion is supposed to be the joker of the group, since he has a very eccentric nature and speaks in the third person, as well as often playing tricks on people where he hopes to get a positive reaction, but more often than not it's a negative one. Despite being the joker of the group, though admittedly I don't find him to be even that funny, he is also rather selfless, since he likes to help the younger members of the army to reach their full potential, and in Radiant Dawn he helps Jeffrey to take back the castle of Fiora. Gameplay-wise, Devion is just as average, since his stats are rather well-rounded and solid, making him an all-around decent unit, and oddly enough he has very good magic stats, which doesn't really mean much since he is a halberdier and they really don't use any magic-based weapons. Now helping this is that the alternative halberdiers completely shit all over Devion, since apart from Radiance, the other halberdier you can use is Nefini, and I did say she was the best halberdier, so naturally she's better than him. In Radiant Dawn you can use Aaron, who despite having low speed and resistance, has great strength, defense, skill and HP, making him quite a potent tank and very effective if trained well. And the other halberdier you can use is Nefini, who is the best halberdier in Fire Emblem, so yeah, you get the idea. Devion is a very middle ground type of character, since he's a very average character and a very average unit in battle. He doesn't have many flaws, but doesn't have many positives either, so it seems rather fitting that Devion lands at number 5 in this list of worst Fire Emblem classes. Or was it Danven? No, I swear it was... Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon is an interesting case when it comes to characters, because in this game it's more to do with quantity over quality, since the amount of units you get in this game is fucking ridiculous, making it very easy to customize and adapt your team accordingly. However, this comes at a cost. Since Shadow Dragon has no support conversations, characters don't really get much development or personality outside of maybe 1 or 2 conversations with a specific unit. Because of this, the characters in Shadow Dragon are less about building supports but rather being strong units with good stats, which is why for number 4 on this list we have Gordon. Gordon is a very interesting case, since he appears in Prologue 4 of Shadow Dragon, and this chapter really throws a curveball into the mix, since you have to sacrifice one of your units in order to advance. Because at the time my team only consisted of 3 Cavaliers and 1 Paladin, I thought it was necessary to sacrifice one of them in order to add an archer unit onto my team, only to regret it shortly afterwards. This is for 2 reasons. One is that Gordon is not a very strong unit. He has good HP and luck, but his strength and resistance are terrible, making him an overall weak archer that doesn't stand any chance against mages. As such, Gordon really couldn't do much outside of taking down the occasional Pegasus Knight, but every other unit just laughed at him. Secondly, is that shortly after you get Gordon, Castor could be recruited, and I found him to be a much better archer, having high levels of both speed and strength, making him a rather potent unit. That's the main reason I don't like Gordon. I had to sacrifice one of my units to recruit him, only to discard him a few chapters later to get a much better unit. Gordon's personality is filled with both determination and pride. He is a very loyal character despite being the youngest member of Master Team, which is definitely admirable, but because Shadow Dragon lacks in support conversations, there really isn't much else to go off aside from what I've just said. Gordon is like that Pokemon you get early in every generation, only to quickly discard it as a better one comes along afterwards. Most of his shortcomings are to do with how Shadow Dragon is structured rather than him being a poor unit and character, but I've said my piece and I still stand by it. Sorry Gordon, but I'm gonna have to box you. Despite being one of the weakest classes in Fire Emblem, medics and clerics are incredibly useful classes. As their name suggests, medics are responsible for healing your units and keeping them alive to fight the good fight. Yes, they cannot defend themselves, and most of their defense stats are so piss poor that they die within seconds of being attacked by anything that isn't magic based, but they are still very useful units, and you want to make sure that your best medics are with you at all times. So why did you give us such a crap medic, Sacred Stones? Mulder's case is similar to Gordon's, where though he's not an awful medic, you receive a new medic a few chapters later who is better than him in just about every way. Not helping this is that not only is he outdone by other medics, but when the standard magic units promote into advanced classes, they all gain the ability to use stars, making Mulder completely pointless. With that said, let's see what Mulder can do before jumping the gun here. Mulder appears in Chapter 3 of Fire Emblem Sacred Stone, alongside Vanessa, Garcia, and Ross. Being your first medic, Mulder is going to be essential for Chapters 3 and 4, since now you have someone who can heal your team, and you have to deal with quite a large amount of enemies in these chapters, making him downright essential. Then Chapter 5 comes along, and we get introduced to Natasha, who is not only one of the few new units who can promote into a Valkyrie, but is also better than Mulder in pretty much every single way, both as a healing unit and as a character. As a unit, Mulder has some very odd stats for a medic, since he has lots of HP and Constitution, allowing him to withstand a lot more hits than most medics, which is definitely useful and probably the best thing about him. Aside from that though, he really isn't that great since he has poor luck and resistance, which is something medics really need, and Natasha, while not being as sturdy, has much better magic, luck, and resistance stats, making her my main medic on every playthrough of Sacred Stones. Now helping this is that even if he promotes into an advanced unit, he is still outdone by pretty much every other mage, since Artur, Lute, Ewan, and Sailor are all better sages, and both Artur and Natasha are better bishops, making Mulder seem rather lackluster overall. Personality-wise, Mulder is kind of like the father of the group, being one of the oldest members of the team, and is a very kind person. With that said, however, he is also very absent-minded and often far too dedicated to his work. Hell, in one of his support conversations, it reveals that he even forgot his own birthday. Adding to this is that Mulder is a rather boring character, doesn't stand out much or make an impact on me, he's just kind of there. Actually, that pretty much describes Mulder as a whole. He's just there. He doesn't stand out, he isn't the best at what he does, he lacks any sort of significant character traits, is outdone by pretty much every other magic unit, and is overall rather bleh. But just as I stated in top 10 Fire Emblem classes, Cavaliers are units you tend to get early game since they are very well-rounded units with very well-rounded stats and high levels of movement, making them very versatile and adaptable to just about any situation or map. Pretty much every Fire Emblem game gives you one within the first couple of chapters. But just like with the advanced unit you start with, Radiant Dawn had to make things more difficult because you don't get a Cavalier until Chapter 6. And by this point, trying to get her to fight at the level she's at is asking for a one-way ticket to hell. Yes, at number 2 in this list, we have Fiona from Radiant Dawn. Fiona suffers the same fate as Yarn, in the sense that if she appeared earlier in the game, she could have been a much more useful character. But sadly that isn't the case. Fiona quickly becomes one unit you'll forget about just as soon as you recruited her. Fiona first appears in Chapter 6 of Radiant Dawn, in which she is the ruler of an independent Morado territory, and at first sides with the Bentley army, but soon joins the Dawn Brigade after witnessing the types of monstrosities the Bentley army is willing to commit. Fiona is someone who is honor bound and protective of her people. She is steadfast and headstrong, and isn't that bad of a character, but because Radiant Dawn has such poor support conversations, Fiona lacks any real depth or complexity. I'm not saying she's a bad character, she's just rather shallow. Gameplay wise, Fiona would have been good if you were able to use her in Path of Radiance, because she has overall very well-rounded stats with a surprising amount of speed and resistance, as well as having unparalleled growth rates, to the point in which she can become stronger than Oscar, Jeffrey, and Titania, which makes her seem like an awesome unit. The only problem is that this is Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. You have next to no opportunities to train her, and as such, she can't do much at the base level you get her, and it's very unlikely that you will go out of your way to train her, since in pretty much every situation, you'd want to focus on your stronger units like Soph, Nolan, Edward, Aaron, Ileana, Zirok, and Jill, since they're overall better units and you've been training them for longer. Not helping this is that despite getting her at Chapter 6, you can only use her in Chapter 7 and 10, since she can't be used in Chapter 7. God damn it, why can't we use Jill? And in Chapter 10, you have no chance of gaining any EXP with her. Why? Because this guy is too busy with the Great Bentley Massacre, but I've talked great lengths about that in a different video. Even after you go back to using the Dawn Brigade, you've got to fight the Lagoose Alliance, and Fiona's got no chance of standing up to them. Fiona seems like a missed opportunity to me. Considering her stats and growth rates, as well as her role in the game, I felt that if she was in Path of Radiance, She could have been a great character. Sadly, like Astrid, Radiant Dawn wasn't kind to her, and thus she lands at the number 2 spot of worst Fire Emblem units, which just leaves number 1. Oh my god, I cannot stand this character! Everything you could say about bad Fire Emblem units is present and accounted for with this character. She's not interesting, she's a weak and useless unit, lacks any sort of real depth or complexity, is a pain in the ass to train, and worst of all, she tarnishes the good name of the best class in Fire Emblem. Every time she opens her mouth, all I can think to myself is...
Shut up, Meg.
I didn't even have to think twice about who would be number 1 in this list. Meg from Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn was one unit I never, ever want the displeasure of using her again. All it took was one chapter to see just how bad of a unit and character she was, and now on every playthrough of Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, I never let her onto the battlefield unless I have to. Let's break this down bit by bit, in order to get a better understanding of just how much she sucks. Meg first appears in Chapter 4 of Radiant Dawn, and is the only standard level knight class in the Dawn Brigade. Her purpose for being in the Dawn Brigade reveals that she is the daughter of Brom, and that she is looking for the man who will become her husband, which I will go over soon enough, don't worry. Gameplay wise, Meg is just disappointing, since she has low level and growth rates for HP, strength, defense, and skill. And this is made worse by the fact she is a fucking knight class! This class is purposely slow, but makes up for it having lots of strength and defense in order to tank enemy hits. Meg doesn't have any of these traits, and thus becomes a knight who can only land a single weak blow while getting the shit kicked out of her. And it doesn't matter that she has good luck, since the stats she needs the most are so piss poor that luck isn't going to mean anything in the long run. It's also more annoying that having a decent knight in Radiant Dawn would have been a great help, since the majority of the Dawn Brigade can't really tank hits, but rather focus on dealing damage rather than receiving it. Having a knight that could take hits could really help the game become more balanced and forgiving. I also don't particularly like Meg as a character. I mean, she's kind-hearted and hard-working. Okay. She's rather shy to some people despite having a cheerful disposition. Okay. And that's really all there is to Meg. Also, there is the fact that she has some sort of romance with Zero, since Brom said that he should marry his eldest daughter in Path of Radiance, and well, here we are. Meg just kind of blindly confesses to Xerox, and he doesn't even seem happy about this. But does Meg notice? Pfft, course not! This romance doesn't really go anywhere because Radiant Dawn's support, or should I say, lack of support conversations, don't flesh out this in any way possible, and even if it did, I couldn't care less because I love the relationship between Ileana and Xerox, and I 100% ship these two together. In fact, their romance is one of my favourite in Fire Emblem history. Overall, Meg just sucked. She's not an interesting character, and just fails at everything on the battlefield, which makes her my number 1 worst unit in Fire Emblem. This has been CRASHX500's. I wish you guys a great night, take care, and even though Fire Emblem has its share of bad characters or useless units, the other characters more than make up for it and help to make this one of the most beloved and cherished video game series of all time, which is why I cannot wait to see what the characters are like in Fire Emblem Fates. As of now, I've got no idea what to think of most of the characters, though I will say, Camilla certainly piques my interests.